Today, we're taking a look at one of the most promising and interesting prototype aircraft developed by Britain during the Second World War. Unfortunately, it never saw service, despite boasting very high performance figures, and this was because of a mix of poor timing, poor planning, and most of all, poor luck. We are, of course, talking about the Martin-Baker MB.5. This fascinating aircraft was the brainchild of James Martin. He and Captain Valentine Baker had founded the firm in 1934, and their first aircraft, a light touring model dubbed the MB-1, would set the stage for a long string of prototypes well into the 1940s. The lineage of the Martin-Bakers would mostly consist of fighter aircraft, the most famous of which originated from an Air Ministry specification that called for a replacement for the Hurricane and the Spitfire, a tall order indeed. The story of the MB-5 actually begins with the MB-3, which was designed to meet Air Ministry specification F-18/39. This called for a high-speed, single-seat fighter, and, with war looming on the horizon, one that was capable of operating in any part of the world, regardless of climate. The specification required a top speed of no less than 400 miles an hour at 15,000 feet, and it strongly suggested the use of a two-stage supercharger to get the most out of the engine regardless of altitude. The armament was expected to be either a pair of 20mm cannons, or 8 .303 caliber machine guns. Though the latter were already beginning to fall out of favour, they were still in large supply. As this new fighter was expected to use these guns for either home defence or potential escort work, the specification called for a fairly high endurance. 2 hours of cruising time, plus an extra 30 minutes at full power to cover both takeoff and combat time, with a further 30% fuel load held in reserve. This was a lot to ask of any manufacturer in 1939, especially when the performance of the Spitfire was considered as the thing to beat for minimum requirements, but Martin-Baker rose to the challenge. The MB-3, the original attempt to develop an aircraft for this specification, was, on paper, an incredibly promising design. Firstly, it was to be equipped with not 2, but 6 20mm Hispano cannons, each with 200 rounds per gun, and secondly, it was to be very powerful. The newly developed Rolls-Royce Griffin was to be the intended power plant, and with it, Martin-Baker predicted a top speed in excess of 410 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. Additionally, the MB-3 had been designed to be as easy as possible to repair and service. Most of the panelling could be easily removed, and the whole thing could be broken down for easy transport, something that was not possible with the current line of aircraft in the RAF. With the design meeting the ministry's criteria, a contract was signed, and 3 prototype aircraft were ordered as the MB-3. Optimistically, the delivery date for the first prototype was slated for the end of the year, but as it turned out, the MB-3 would not be completed until much, much later. This was for 3 reasons. Firstly, it became very apparent that the Rolls-Royce Griffin would not be ready for use in time, and so an alternative had to be found. Secondly, Martin-Baker was not a particularly large company, and completing a full prototype in 6 months was a huge ask. And thirdly, by the end of the year, Britain was at war, and Martin-Baker were quickly swamped with other production orders which took a higher priority. Because of all this, the MB-3 was still incomplete by mid-1941, and the company was then informed that there was no longer a need for it, and no production orders were forthcoming. But, seeing as it was mostly complete, they decided to finish the prototype anyway. By this point, it now had the 36-litre, 2,020 horsepower Napier Sabre, the same H-24 engine that would power the Hawker Typhoon and the Hawker Tempest. But unlike those aircraft, it would not feature the same chin-mounted radiator that made them so recognisable. Martin wanted all the speed he could get, and to cut down on drag, he moved the coolant and oil radiators to the underside of the wings. Mounting the coolant system in this way certainly cleaned up the aircraft's lines, but the Sabre engine repeatedly encountered problems with overheating during tests, and this was a problem that would eventually have fatal consequences. The prototype flew for the first time on August 31st, 1942, with Martin-Baker at the controls. Flying with ballast to simulate the weight of guns and ammunition, it immediately demonstrated its potential when it attained a top speed of 415 miles an hour at 20,000 feet. The trials for the MB3 would continue from August into September, but then tragedy would strike. On the 12th of September, Martin-Baker had just lifted off when the Napier Sabre engine failed due to a broken sleeve drive crank. Baker attempted an emergency landing, putting his aircraft down in a field beyond the runway, but he hit a tree stump, or a hay bale, sources conflict on this, and he was killed, the aircraft going up in flames. This event essentially stopped the MB3 project in its tracks, and Martin-Baker was now missing one of its original founders. The death of Baker is considered to have deeply affected Martin, who had been Baker's best friend and partner since the firm's inception. As a result, the trajectory of the company would be altered significantly in the following years. However, Martin was still determined to build a superior fighter and carry on the work that he and Baker had started. He therefore began on a redesign of their MB3, making numerous improvements, re-engining it with a Rolls-Royce Griffin, and the resulting aircraft from this would become the MB5. Design and construction were in some ways remarkably similar to that of the MB3, but there were of course many changes. The aircraft sported a tubular steel frame skinned with aluminium panels, most of which were detachable, which meant that it retained the MB3's ease of assembly. This would be a strong point of the aircraft, in fact, allowing a very high degree of modularity and repairability, as aluminium panels, which functioned as the skin of the airframe, could simply be replaced if needed and taken off during maintenance by the ground crew. The instantly recognizable clipped short wings of the airframe were also carried on for its predecessor as well, though internally there were in fact many alterations. The armament was in fact downgraded from the MB3. It now had 4 20mm Hispano Mark II cannons, down from 6, though the ammo load would remain unchanged, with 200 rounds per gun for a total of 800. The bulk of the systems would now be operated pneumatically, including the undercarriage, brakes, and split trailing edge flaps, whilst the control surfaces were completely covered in metal, with the exception of the rudder, which was skinned in fabric. The biggest change would of course be found in the nose. A re-engine was needed, that much had been clear, and the Bristol Centaurus was briefly considered and plans drawn up. This radial-powered aircraft would be referred to as the MB4, but it only existed on paper. Instead, as previously mentioned, the powerful Rolls-Royce Griffin would be the powerplant of choice. The Griffin 83 was installed, producing upwards of 2,300 horsepower and driving 2 contra-rotating 3-bladed propellers. A popular myth exists that the MB5 was based on the P-51 Mustang, though there is no supporting evidence to suggest that this is anything more than just that, a myth. The similar design and shape of the coolant radiator on the lower fuselage is a contributing factor to the superficial similarity between the two, but in fact, the MB5 has a drastically different fuselage and wing construction design to the P-51, and was primarily based on Martin-Baker's previous line of aircraft, which predates the P-51 by years. It's most likely a case of convergent evolution, 2 high-performing aircraft designed with powerful inline engines and high speeds, at similar times, resulting in similar design choices being made. In terms of dimensions, the MB5 was comparatively large for an aircraft of its type, at least in the United Kingdom, with a wingspan of 35 feet and a length and height of 37'9" and 12'6" respectively. This made it significantly longer than the Spitfire it was intended to replace, and more akin to the larger single-engined fighters fielded by the United States, thus adding fuel to the rumours that part of its design was lifted from the P-51. This made the MB5, rather predictably, quite heavy, weighing in at 9,233 pounds empty, and 11,500 pounds when fully loaded. Construction of the aircraft would begin in 1943, though the process would be rather slow due to other commitments the company had been held to. There was still a little something called the Second World War going on, and frustratingly for the Air Ministry, Mr. James Martin was apparently something of a perfectionist with this design, as he repeatedly held back the prototype, making small alterations and tinkering with it as he went along. This tinkering would eventually allow the aircraft to maximise its performance before its first flight trials, but it may have also unfortunately been a contributing factor to the eventual decision to not pursue with further development later on. As Captain Baker had been the sole test pilot for the company, an outside pilot had to be brought in for the test flights of the MB.5. And this was Brian Grinstead, loaned from Rotol, a fellow British aviation firm that specialised in propellers. On the 23rd of May 1944, the completed prototype, given the serial number R2496, would be disassembled and transported to the testing grounds at RAF Harwell. Immediately, the ability to disassemble, transport, reassemble, and fly a modern fighter aircraft in less than a day speaks volumes about the intelligent engineering that had gone into the MB.5's design, let alone the fact that reportedly assembling it took just 1 hour. But, unfortunately, it would not be all good news for the prototype. Grinstead would in fact be fairly critical of the MB.5 upon finishing the initial flight, mainly citing some pronounced directional instability. Martin, however, was not discouraged, and he got to work drawing up some changes to remedy the aircraft's deficiencies, based mostly on careful analysis of Grinstead's detailed flight report. It was found that the large contra-rotating propellers reduced the authority of the rudder, which had remained virtually unchanged from the MB.3. So to combat this, Martin would refit the prototype with a significantly taller vertical tail surface. This modification took almost 6 months to complete, owing to testing various rudder sizes, but when Grinstead flew the MB.5 again, the handling had improved dramatically. In terms of performance, the aircraft was highly praised, recording a top speed of 395 miles an hour at sea level, which rose to 425 miles an hour at 6,000 feet, and finally up to 459 miles an hour at 20,000. It climbed pretty quickly as well. In 6.5 minutes, the MB.5 could reach 20,000 feet, which was roughly on par with comparable late-war propeller-driven fighters, but the acceleration was considered to be one of the few shortcomings, along with some lingering directional instability due to the high weight of the aircraft. Though conversely, this also gave improved acceleration in dives, which allowed it to reach extremely high speeds, by which all accounts it excelled at. Range and endurance was also reviewed favourably, with the 750-litre fuel capacity, housed in 2 tanks in front and behind the pilot, allowing a range of up to 1,120 miles. Additionally, the spaced-out design of the undercarriage, like that on the MB.3, gave a much safer and robust landing performance to the MB.5 when compared to the narrow-track undercarriage of the Spitfire. As an added bonus, the contra-rotating propellers negated the problems caused by engine torque. This improved control on the ground and in the air, as the aircraft wasn't pulled by torque to one side like on a conventional single-propeller fighter, and this would have made the MB.5 easier to learn for inexperienced pilots, had it entered service perhaps 2 years earlier to actually be useful. In the closing months of 1944, with barely 40 hours of flight time logged on the MB.5, the Air Ministry informed Martin that they would not be pursuing further development or placing any production orders for the aircraft. This was unfortunately a case of supply and demand. The war in Europe was winding down, and the RAF did not urgently need a new generation of fighter designs. And when they did, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the new generation would belong to jet-powered aircraft. In fact, some were already in development. And so, the MB.5 was now relegated to a life of testing and public exhibitions. Among these, during 1945, the MB.5 would take part in a demonstration in front of Winston Churchill at Farnborough, but it had the misfortunate timing of suffering an engine failure mid-flight. Following this near miss, it was operated far more conservatively over the next 18 months, being flown by a variety of test pilots and accumulating just a further 40 hours of flight time. Though little used, during this time and in the following years, it received almost universal praise from whoever had a chance to fly it. In June 1946, the aircraft would return to Farnborough and take part in an aerobatic show in the hands of Polish squadron leader Jan Zurikowski, a man famous for his aerobatic skills, and one that would proclaim that the MB.5 was the finest he had ever flown. In further testing throughout 1947, the MB.5 would be flown by Wing Commander Maurice A. Smith at de Havilland at Hatfield, before again returning to RAE Farnborough. At Farnborough, the aircraft would then be flown by Captain Eric Winkle Brown, a pilot famous for his wartime service and his legendary career as a test pilot. Brown would mirror the opinions of his peers, complimenting the aircraft's impressive top speed and handling, saying, "In my opinion, this is an outstanding aircraft, particularly when regarded in the light of the fact that it made its maiden flight as early as the 23rd of May, 1944. Despite his high praise, he did mention that the aircraft's biggest vice was still its directional instability, a trait which apparently the enlarged vertical stabilizer had not completely fixed. By this point, the MB.5 was in its autumn years. For the next 2 years of its life, it would be moved to the Air Ministry Servicing Development Unit at RAF Wattisham and used predominantly as a training and testing airframe until 1950. Then it was relocated to RAF Bircham Newton, where the much-loved but unfortunate MB.5, now a 6-year-old airframe, would meet its ultimate demise. It was used as a ground target in training exercises until 1963, when what was left of it was then burned. It was a negligent and undeserved end to such a historically interesting aircraft, one that should probably have been preserved and stuck in a museum. And unfortunately, this means that today we only have a replica built in Nevada, United States. Now, this was built 2 meters shorter than the original and used the wings of a P-51 Mustang. Had the MB-5 gone into service, it would have been one of the fastest combat aircraft in the world, for the time at least. But sadly, it was not to be. It was simply too late to garner interest, and 80 years on, we can only speculate on what might have been had it been built just a little bit faster. The location of Captain Valentine Baker's crash site was found in December of 2020, and is located at Aylesbury Vale Golf Club. A memorial of Valentine Baker, along with a bust of him, was erected there, and it's now open to the public, along with a further memorial at RAF Wing next to the hangar where the MB-3 was originally stored. After a few more ventures into aircraft design, the post-war jet-powered MB-6 and 7, Martin-Baker as a company would produce no more. And Martin himself, as a result of Baker's death, would reorganize and dedicate his company, and the rest of his life, to the design and production of aircraft ejection systems to save pilots' lives, which is what the company is famous and still successful for today. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the patrons. You know, I finally believe we are back on to a regular video schedule again. Long may it remain so. Now, there may not be an upload this coming Wednesday, as I'm hoping for a long video to be ready for next weekend, but we'll see how things pan out. A big shout out, of course, to the Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members, and a special thank you to Jason Duban, who is the newest member of this special group. Patreon has been a bit slow with updating details on my end this week, so if anyone is missing from these lists, I apologise, and hopefully it will all be up to date next week. But, as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.